I will begin by briefly introducing our moderator, Cavelle Joseph Santoma, who will then take over to introduce her panel. Cavelle Joseph Santoma is a strategic human resource professional with more than 15 years comprehensive experience working in the private and public sectors. And Cavelle, if you can put on your video, so we will add you to the screen. She is currently the president of the Human Resource Management Association of Trinidad and Tobago as well. Cavelle works as the Divisional Manager, Human Resources at the Urban Development Corporation of Trinidad and Tobago, UDCOT. This after serving for about 7 years as the head of human resources at NIPDEC. Very proudly, I will share she is currently pursuing the Doctorate of Business Administration with a specialization on leadership at Walden University. Now, you will read more about Cavelle. She's an extremely wonderful person, very accomplished, and so there's a lot more information about her in the agenda, but I will just share those brief background information about her and hand over to her to introduce her panel as briefly as well, as their profiles are also in the agenda sent to you. Over to you, Cavelle.
Okay. Thank you, Kamla, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this panel discussion. I know it's going to be an exciting conversation this afternoon. So I will start by introducing our first panelist, Ms. Ali Matalon. Ali is the founder and CEO of CorpCare, an organization committed to supporting businesses transition towards more sustainable operations and practices by leveraging ESG frameworks. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration and Political Science from the Northeastern University and a Master's of Public Administration in Urban and Social Policy from Columbia University. She has expertise in policy, strategy, social impact. She's very passionate about building an equitable future through people-first businesses. So Ali, welcome to this panel discussion. Next, we have Mr. Omar Mohammed. He is the CEO of the Cropper Foundation and also the a nonprofit organization in Trinidad and Tobago that has been advancing sustainable development in the Caribbean for over 2 decades. Under his leadership, the Cropper Foundation has spearheaded numerous sustainability-focused initiatives encompassing data science, technology for sustainability, natural capital accounting, and civil society governance. He leads and bolsters the strategic direction of the Cropper Foundation, and the foundation, as we know, has a solid reputation throughout the Caribbean for some of its impactful initiatives. He has coordinated several UNESCO programs within the education system in Trinidad and Tobago, really addressing critical issues like bullying, school violence, and of course, climate change education. In addition to all of this, he serves as a director at CAISO, an organization that is focused on sex and gender justice, and one of the Caribbean's most influential LGBTQ nonprofit organization. From an academic perspective, he has a Master's of Studies in Sustainability Leadership from the University of Cambridge and an MBA in Innovation, specializing in innovation, and also a Bachelor of Science in Environmental and Natural Resource Management from the University of the West Indies. So let's welcome Mr. Omar Mohammed to the panel.
Hi, everyone.
And last but certainly not least is Ms. Alison Dillon Kibirige. Chibwe. My apologies, Alison. Alison is a global expert on corporate governance, and that focus includes governance, strategy, diversity, ethics, CSR, and risk management. She is the founder of AMDK Governance Solutions, a business set up in 2007, which focuses on improving corporate governance practices in all sectors, private, public, and not-for-profit globally. Her work at AMDK has taken her throughout the Caribbean, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. She serves on several boards, committees, and industry working groups since the early 1980s and is a former member of the SA, and a director of the leadership team at Uganda Limited. Alison is a lawyer and a fellow at ICSA. She was awarded the 2013 ICSA President's Medal for Meritorious Service at its inaugural ICSA Company Secretary of the Year Award back in 2005. Let's welcome Alison to the panel as well. So I think everyone will agree that we have a fantastic panel here, and based on their backgrounds, they're more than qualified to discuss the topic at hand this afternoon as we look at the issue around climate change and governance. And up until the 2000s, board members typically limited themselves to an oversight role, often rubber stamping and approving CEO strat plans without even possibly getting into details about its formulation. Boards focused back then on how well the organizations did in terms of profitability and, of course, handling losses and the consequences of losses back then. So that was the focus. It was more review in terms of perspective and more focus on financial performance. But a lot has changed since then between additional legislation put in place to really bolster that governance aspect and a lot of consequences emerging from major corporate espionage kind of activities that took place, especially in the United States. We saw that now, and we see now that there's a greater increase in board involvement, not only in strategy, but also recognizing that they really do have a duty to steer companies in the right direction and away from catastrophe and away from activities that could really lead organizations into detriment, right? So that takes us into climate change and the strategic direction and considerations for every business where climate change is concerned. And as board members, and for anyone who serve as board members, recognizing now more than ever, we do have to take a proactive role in helping companies respond to critical enterprise risks, issues, business complexity, technology disruptions, and even the social and environmental obligations around some of the activities of those organizations. And climate change risks and opportunities includes part of that strategic agenda. So that's why CCGI felt it was important to have this topic at this year's conference. So we recognize now that board members have to now consider climate change as a separate imperative that organizations must focus on. And it may perhaps seem at one point beyond the scope and obligations of directors, but it is no longer seen as that. So that being said, and when we consider some of the utterances of the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and he spoke even back in 2023 at the UN 6th IPCC report, he unequivocally said that, in short, our world needs climate action on all fronts. Everything, everywhere, all at once. But who is going to deliver on this action? As simple as it may seem, when you say change and change everything, everywhere, all at once, what does that mean? Who are the individuals everywhere, all at once that are needed to shift systems and structures to assist all of us with addressing this climate emergency? So I would like to ask our panelists to kick things off with their own perspective on the climate emergency that we're now hearing about. And I mean, I will turn my attention first to Ali to kick things off and share with us your perspective on what you deem to be the climate emergency.
Sure. Thank you so much, Cavelle, for that wonderful introduction. It's an honor to be on this panel serving with all of you. Incredibly qualified panelists and to be a part of this governance week. I think Pamela and I spoke about this a little bit leading up to today's conversation. And I'd like to focus kind of my perspective maybe on the Caribbean region and some of the barriers towards financing for a just transition towards a more climate resilient future for the Caribbean region, which is a huge challenge that we are facing. And I think this concept of everyone all together, all at once is really challenging, especially for regions like ours. But I think it holds a lot of merit and a lot of weight. I think, even when you were sharing at the beginning, Cavelle, I think one of the things is that we do need, an influx of regulation that supports a more climate resilient future and encourages innovation in terms of more climate smart solutions that are being rolled out and sold by businesses. But I think it's important to frame the conversation today in the context of the Caribbean being, one of, if not the most vulnerable region in the world. I mean, where I live in Kingston, it's in one of the top 10 cities to risk climate departure in the world. The IMF estimates that we're going to need about $100 billion worth of capital to embark on this just transition, and that's equal to about a third of our annual economic output as a region. So just to put that in context, it's more capital inflow than we've seen in the region, and it's capital inflow that has proven hard to raise to this point, especially in terms of the vehicles through which it's distributed. We also have, this kind of twin vulnerability because we have incredibly high costs of natural disasters, but we also tend to have, a very high price tag on energy. So there's a lot of different things at play, and I think, there's certainly work to be done at the government level, which I'm sure we'll get into throughout this conversation. There are certainly things to be done at the governance level of organizations, which is where I sit in the work that I do on a day-to-day basis. And I think there's some initiatives that are happening or that are coming to fruition in the region that we should be paying attention to that will enable this a little bit more effectively. So one of the most recent is that the Jamaica Stock Exchange has put out a guide on the issuance of green bonds. So that's very, very new, and stakeholders are still being brought up to speed on how that's gonna function. But I think it's a step in the right direction. The CARICOM Development Fund, along with the USAID, have come together to create the Caribbean Community Resilience Fund, which is about $135 million fund directed towards social and climate issues, and it's going to be managed by a regional financier, Cygnus, which is the fund manager there on that part of the equation. So I think that's something to watch and be mindful of. And the governance around all of that too, right? What's the impact reporting that supports these types of initiatives? How are various stakeholders being, kept informed? What frameworks and regulatory guides are we using to do this work? There's, a few other things. There are some issuance of blue bonds in Belize and Barbados, catastrophe bonds for financial protection against hurricane damage in Jamaica. There's a lot of different things happening in the space. And I think that financing piece is a really important part for us to discuss as a part of our collective conversation today, because we need the money to make it happen, right? We need the capital to support this transition that our region needs to make. So I'll leave it there, and I'm really keen to hear my fellow panelists' contributions and how today's conversation will flow. But thanks so much, Cavelle.
Thank you so much, Ali. You shared about financing, governance, some of the structures that has been put in place in Jamaica to start the ball rolling. But before we get into deeper parts of that conversation, let me get a sense from Omar now in terms of his own perspective of what this really means in terms of the climate change crisis that we are presently facing. In his context, in his own words, what is your perspective on the subject at hand?
Thanks, Cavelle. I think Ali gave a really good synopsis of sort of where we are in terms of building resilience, particularly from a climate perspective. But I just want to, give people some homework to do when they leave today's panel. So I just want to make reference to a couple of things, and this is, again, I'm coming from a nonprofit space. And only in the last few years, we've been able to work with particularly private sector entities to help drive home, again, some of the issues around why should they care about some of these big picture sustainability issues. And a couple of things that we try to do in terms of messaging is to draw their attention to a couple of terms. One being this idea of the climate crisis and being part of this idea of the tragedy of the commons, which is a term that is really speaking about the global environment is a public resource, no one owns it, so people have tended to act in their own interest and their own interests, of course, in expense of everyone else. And that's why, especially like Ali said, regions like the Caribbean, we have this double vulnerability or double inequality, I should say, where we're impacted the most, but we've done the least to cause that impact. So we have this idea of the tragedy of the commons, and then what are our responsibilities around combating that? Then we also have this idea of the tragedy of the horizon, which is a term that was coined by Mark Carney, who was the former governor of the Bank of England. And this is, again, talking about the impacts of all these existential issues generally extend beyond the horizons of usual decision making. It could be your business year, it could be a political cycle, and so on. So in many cases, these impacts are ignored because they don't fit into our 1 to 5 year cycles, because it extends way beyond that. So they tend to be ignored from a strategic perspective. And the final thing I wanted to do in terms of homework is to ask folks to look at the Das Gupta review, which is a review of the economics of biodiversity, which was commissioned by the UK government a few years ago. And looked at the economics of biodiversity loss and conservation, and had some very key messages around the fact that our economies are not adjacent to nature like we've treated it in the past, but are in fact embedded within nature. And therefore, our society is also embedded within nature. And the reason that I'm talking about nature so much in the context of climate is related to a pet peeve of mine. Well, not so much a pet peeve, really, but a very clear position that, especially in places like the Caribbean and others, sort of quote unquote developing countries, however you might think of that term, to look at what are the things within our capacity to influence in combating the climate crisis. So we all have a responsibility to do things like reduce emissions. It's part of the Paris Agreement. It's called common but differentiated responsibility. So even if you emit a little, we still have a responsibility as a global community to reduce emissions. However, in places like the Caribbean as well, it might be controversial, but if we all stop emitting tomorrow, it's not going to make a dent in the impacts of climate change that we will eventually face. So we have to start thinking about, particularly from a strategic perspective, if we have to make these investments, financial investments and so on, where should we be making these investments to ensure that we build resilience? And some of that would be infrastructure, of course, and reducing energy dependence. But a big part, which I do think has been ignored, is really this focus on nature, and nature being a powerful ally in climate resilience, particularly in the region. And the problem is that we tend to have externalized nature to a very large extent, particularly in the region, even though it's all around us. And this idea of, what are we building resilience for, if not to expand the well-being of the people that live in the region? I think we need to really, at a strategic level, interrogate what that means. Because particularly for private sector organizations, I mean, we need to understand that, productivity and well-being really is that engagement between a market of goods and services and natural capital, or the assets that nature provides. You can't produce anything without nature. And the fact is that on both sides, climate is expected to severely reduce nature's own productivity, biodiversity loss, and so on, with the resultant reduction in the ability of the market to meet the needs or requirements of the people that it serves. But on the other hand, a stronger, more conserved natural capital asset base is probably our strongest, particularly in the region, ally against the climate impacts that are supposed to hit us. So a couple other things, some homework before you all go. It's really to look and see, as private sector agencies and public sector agencies, to really take a step back and understand, you know, while you think you might be divested from nature, let's say if you are a clothing company, for example, you feel like, okay, maybe our major relationship is pollution, people throwing away our clothes. But I just want people to take a step back from a strategic position and think, what are our dependencies and impacts on nature? If the cotton industry were to become more fragile because cotton is a water-intensive crop, if cotton becomes more expensive because the countries that supply us have increased incidence of droughts, which is happening all across Latin America, how will that impact our ability to be productive? So really to take a step back and understand, how does nature fit into our sustainability strategies? And to really keep pushing this idea of investing in nature, particularly in places like the Caribbean, as a very strategic vehicle to ensure climate resilience. And it's also really important because basically the reduction in biodiversity and nature by climate change is expected to be like 1% of global GDP. Reducing the market's own ability to provide that level of service. And interestingly, well, not surprisingly, 90% of those damages are going to be borne by developing and least developed countries. So from a strategic perspective for companies in the global south, you know, really to start paying closer attention to that. But also to understand on the flip side, the opportunities that we have as businesses and public sector agencies to invest in nature, which can, you know, expected to generate up to 10 trillion US in annual value from nature-based solutions in relation to climate. And here in the Caribbean, you know, close to 100 billion. And if you remember what the figure that Ali said, you know, it makes sense to see, okay, if we could invest in this, can we actually recoup some of those costs in terms of adaptation and so on. So that's my specific push, is for people to, again, conceptualize climate and climate resilience as a strategic idea in the context of the things that we have most influence over, which is how we protect and conserve the natural assets that provide to us the biggest opportunities for adaptation, as well as other types of value and fundamentally human well-being in general. Thanks, Cavelle. Back over to you.
Excellent, Omar. I mean, you give us a lot of food for thought there. I mean, introducing us to terms like tragedy of the commons, tragedy of the horizons, consideration for the economics of biodiversity, and of course, the impact of climate change in terms of the environment and nature. I mean, we are seeing more and more frequently severe storms, floods, droughts, fires, wildfires happening, and these things are threatening our cities, our communities, our crops, wildlife. And essentially, you are saying that in terms of our pursuits for productivity, profits, and everything else, we have to consider the environment and consider climate and climate change from the perspective of climate resilience as well. So it's a good starting point, a lot to discuss, but I really do need to bring Alison into the conversation now to get her perspective on what the climate emergency is from where she sits and the organizations that she serves. What does that mean to you, Alison? Let's hear your perspective on this.
Okay, thank you very much. I've come at it from a slightly different perspective because I tend to work more with organizations and trying to work with those organizations to basically say, okay, what role can we play in this? And I think one of the things that I've seen as I've been visiting other countries is there was very much this kind of approach that, okay, this is going to be government-led. We've got to wait and see what government initiatives are coming. The conversation I think Ali mentioned about, well, let's wait and see what we're going to be mandated to do, what we might get grants or subsidies to do. And it was very much waiting to see what was going to come from government and regulators. And I think one of the changes that we're starting to see is that organisations are waking up to the fact, actually, we have a role to play in this, particularly if the governments who are making all of these commitments at COP, whatever number it happens to be, if they're going to actually achieve those commitments. And so I and other people that I meet are kind of talking to companies to say, okay, so what are you going to do about it? And I think, you know, we started off with conversations about what are we actually talking about? What are we going to call it? Is it CSR? Is it sustainability? Is it ESG? And, you know, depending what organization or the supernatural national or bilateral organizations, again, have different definitions of what all of those things mean. I think, you know, if you look at sustainability, we're talking about what used to be planet, people. It used to be profit. We now have changed profit to performance because we're trying to get people moved away from this idea of financial performance, but actually looking at a kind of more holistic performance. We've got, you know, ESG, which is a fairly new term, CSR that has been around for hundreds of years. I think one of the challenges we've got with ESG is it's becoming very politicized. BlackRock came out, who are the largest fund managers, and basically at some stage were implying that they were going to not invest in companies, whether they were fossil fuel or whether they could be seen to be, as they put it, damaging the environment or society. They've now walked that back, and they're now talking about supporting organisations to transform. So you have organisations like BP, British Petroleum, who've even changed their purpose to now being an organisation that is performing to transform. So there's very much you're hearing about transformation with a reality that needs to be funded. You can't just turn the tap off today and expect everybody to suddenly be environmentally friendly tomorrow. I think there's also a lot of thought around asking organisations, how can you innovate? I think Bill Gates was the first to come out and say the technologies that we need to actually get to where we need to be don't actually exist today. So how do we get to them? I mean, we're all sitting here looking at phones or laptops or computer screens. If we turn off the taps on oil, all of these things are made from petrochemicals, so they wouldn't exist potentially. So, you know, there is a long way to go, but I think organisations need to be asking themselves, what can we contribute to get there? I think if you're doing that, they need to also tell people, how do we get there? And I think, you know, because that then helps reinforce that there is a movement and that organisations are taking this seriously. And I think one of the biggest things that they can do is to tell stories about what they're doing. I've worked with many organisations in developing countries, and many of them are actually doing, whether we call them sustainability, CSR, ESG kind of projects, some of them without realising that's what they're doing. Some of them are doing them but don't actually share what they're doing so that other organisations can learn from those experiences and learn what can be done with limited amounts of resource. And I think, you know, I think looking at how we spread and share those stories are quite important. I think my final point would be, don't underestimate how difficult it is to actually capture this information within organisations. Organisations have been set up for hundreds of years to capture financial data. They're not set up to capture and talk about the non-financial data, which is what we're talking about when we're talking about how are we responding to environmental issues. And I know organisations are struggling with that, and you know, being able to capture that data in a form that is credible, is timely, that they can then pass on and share that information. I think I'm out of time for talking, so I'll leave it there. And hopefully we can get some interesting conversations and questions going. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alison. I mean, you've brought in another dynamic into the conversation as we discuss the whole issue of government's role. And I mean, in the Caribbean, we're no stranger to the fact that a lot of businesses and a lot of the other interest groups tend to wait to see what governments and regulators are doing on issues in terms of leading the charge, leading the topic, leading the issue in playing their leadership role, right? We tend to wait on the government. But you are now saying or signaling that organizations now have to wake up to the fact that they have a role to play in all of this. And therefore, is how do we get all sectors on board to understand that we all have a role, we all contribute and could have a role in all of this. But then you also raise the critical issue of financing and how we could now look at the issue around financing, because we heard earlier from Ali that it's almost $100 billion to address climate change issues for us in the Caribbean. So how do we look at the issue around financing some of these sustainability efforts towards making an improvement towards climate change? And how could private sector play a critical role in addressing climate change by investing in low carbon technologies? We heard technology spoken of earlier, by looking at resilience and climate resilience and how we can invest in terms of our operations, our plants, our equipment to build a more resilient space, a workspace and all of that. So we know that private sector financing, government financing, and all the different parties have a role to play in all of this. So lots of food for thought here this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So I would like to now ask the question around, at least center it now, about how should the government and private sector work together to fight the climate change or to fight the issues around the sustainability challenges we face as a region as we address the issue of climate change. And I invite any member of the panel to kickstart this. And of course, I remind our attendees this afternoon that you could also place your questions in the chat, and I will pose the questions to the panel as well. So we can kickstart with that, and I will look into the chat for the questions. Yes, Omar, kick things off.
Yeah, thanks. So just to remind myself about the question, how can governments and private sector work better together to mobilize financing and resources and so on? Yes? That's okay, good. Well, I think, so in relation to climate and climate resilience, no matter what, you know, certain factions might say the science is very clear, it's, you know, it's pretty incontrovertible. You know, we earlier, like, you know, a couple decades ago, models and stuff weren't necessarily so refined. We couldn't really see what was happening in places as small as the region or even in terms of at the country level. Now that's not, we have, the science is pretty clear. We understand what's going to happen. Like Ali mentioned about Kingston, we understand these things, and a lot of these impacts and the required actions, for the most part, are well understood by the technical agencies that support governments, and then therefore governments understand. These are all also recorded, and in most countries, national determined contributions, NDCs, which for those of you all who might know, it's almost like each country's roadmap to get to the Paris Agreement reductions. So, countries have different percentage reductions across different emitting areas, transport, agriculture, etc. And in most cases have very clear action, most cases have very clear action plans on how to move from the baseline that we're at to these required reductions. So, it's not like we are sort of begging for sponsorship for something that's intangible. The opportunities for very specific, tangible investment are there. There are these roadmaps, particularly at a country level and even regionally. So I think what can be done, especially for things in relation to, if we're thinking about more structured approaches, where companies might be more interested in investing through ESG vehicles, which Ali could probably talk more about. Companies can work with government in alignment with these NDCs and so on to set very specific targets that for emissions reductions and so on, which are tied to country ambitions and not just in a vacuum. And if they're able to do that and allocate financing at a landscape level, we could get to a point where even if a company doesn't want to work directly with a government for whatever reason, collectively, if things are aligned with these sort of overall targets, we can get to a place where we have this, these specific reductions that are aligned with the government's own sort of public, emissions reductions approach and so on. So, I would say, just to wrap up, that, we have these plans already in place. The science is clear for the most part in relation to climate. So start there first, see what different countries or regional ambitions are in terms of sectors and different levels of emissions reductions. Maybe see how it aligns with a company's own specific, maybe focal area or sector, and what they can contribute. And then maybe best case scenario, which is really ambitious, is to work with the government to see how you can finance particularly longer term investment priorities. Again, in trying to combat this idea of tragedy of the horizons thing. So, but that takes, I think, ambition and willingness to work with some of those political entities, which I know is probably not the most attractive, but the data is there, so use it.
But obviously I'm not as familiar with each of the Caribbean country plans. I do know in 3 countries that I've spent time in, which was Uganda, obviously now the UK, and I do spend time in Saudi Arabia, which has its challenges being one of the biggest oil producers. Now, the case in the UK is they're having to roll back on a lot of their plans, and one of the main reasons is technology is just not keeping up with everything. So, they had plans that every new house that was built with not gas or electric heating, but with environmentally friendly heating. They've had to roll back because they just can't produce enough of these machines. I don't know what they call them, but to actually put in all the new houses that have been built. We hear about, you know, the same with electric cars. They can't produce enough of the batteries and the things to make electric cars work. We had requirements here that, you know, all of the diesel cars were going to be phased out. And again, they've had to roll back. You know, I had similar stories in Uganda. Saudi, quite interestingly, is managing to keep up. And I think mainly because their focus is on getting to this net zero. So they are pushing, because obviously they still want to be producing oil. And they've brought in things like every new building has to be solar powered. And so you might see on the TV, they've lots of adverts on satellite TV around these whole, you know, resorts or new villages or towns developed by an organization called Neon that are totally solar driven. They're not using fossil fuels anymore. So I think, you know, you've got this challenge that there might be a will, but in many cases that will is not being able to materialize just because the kind of assets that you need to actually deliver it just don't exist at the moment, or they don't exist in the scale that we need them to exist. And I don't know, you know, how quickly that scaling up is going to happen. And I'm not seeing an awful lot of what's the word I'm looking for? Positivity in that area that's actually going to happen very quickly. So I don't know, Omar, your views or Ali's views, whether you've seen different things, but I think it's, you know, it's great that we have these commitments, but the reality is we need to see them delivered. And if there are genuine challenges in that, we need to see whether it's, you know, public sector, private sector companies stepping up to deliver what needs to be delivered to actually achieve. Because governments don't actually make anything. So that's the big challenge.
Okay. Omar, you want to respond to that? Because I know Alison directed that to you a bit.
Oh, well, yeah, sure. I think, I mean, again, you know, I'm not from private sector, public sector, and, you know, maybe I have my own slightly more radical thoughts on some of these things, particularly in relation to what I think is an what's the word? Not over reliance, an overestimation of the viability of some of these technologies for carbon removal. Not the ones that are now in terms of solar energy and so on, but like carbon capture and removal. You know, there's a lot of conversation on this time scale at which those things become viable on a large enough scale. But the fact is that there are many models and stuff now that are overemphasizing the viability of those things. And I don't think it's at the expense of investment in, again, nature-based solutions. But spoiler alert, I do think they are at the expense of large-scale investment in nature-based solutions. And I mean, I don't think they are competitors. Like one isn't necessarily better than the other. One, however, we have in our wheelhouse right now, which is nature-based solutions. And the other one, you know, from a more private sector investment level, that's where I think the more infrastructure ones come in. But one thing I'll just have to say about the nature-based ones is that, you know, one of the big issues that is not captured when you look at counting carbon and so on are the sort of social impacts related to the climate crisis. So one of the drawbacks, at least in my opinion, our over-reliance on some of these infrastructural things that in many cases they come without an associated social benefit, as opposed to some of the nature-based things, which are like, forest regeneration and so on. Most of the times, if managed properly from a governance perspective, they come with associated social benefits to communities and so on. So it's really about understanding what the balance is and making sure that we don't over-prioritize a particular approach over the other. And I think that's something which at a public sector level would have to be, to a large extent, guided by the state. So
I saw 2 comments in the chat, and also Kamla's hand was up. So Kamla, you want to go first before I turn my attention to the chat?
Yes, thanks so much, Cavelle. And I'm glad Omar actually came right at that point that I felt we needed to also elaborate on a bit. And more so because both he and Ali have the direct experience working with NGOs. And it's something that Derek mentioned in the chat as well, the amount of work that is done there. But because of the amount of time you've spent, Omar, I know with the Cropper Foundation for so long, and Ali, tremendous work being done in Jamaica. We do understand that the magnitude of the problem requires a certain amount of government involvement as well. Given your experience, can you identify, have you found that government has been responsive enough in the way it needs to be to facilitate some of the changes which need to be made? Are there areas that we need more action on the part of whether it's NGOs or private sector to help the government along? Because at the end of the day, while you guys shared, and you're quite right with that, there's an expectation that government would lead this action because of how enormous it is. But we can't wait for government to do it alone, because government is busy with also doing things like fixing roads and so many other things that, if we want to ensure that this is happening in a timely manner, there may be areas that we can assist. So what can we do? Are you seeing enough because you were in this space? And what are these areas that government has been able to actually make some commitments to? And what gaps are there, if any? Ali, if you want to.
Sure. Omar, you want me to start? I feel like Kamla's putting us on the spot a little bit to talk about what we think are the positives and the pitfalls. I don't think that overall there has been necessarily enough intervention in this space. What I will say, and I'll limit this to Jamaica, I think, for instance, before I do that, I've been it's been helpful to me and very comforting to me to see things like Prime Minister Motley's speeches on an international level calling for international cooperation in the support of our region, which is so vulnerable, right? So I think that advocacy needs to keep going and being, furthered by other leaders in the region as well, because it's really critical that, as Omar said, a region that emits the least is the most impacted, right? And that is, even in our conversation that we were having, Kamla, earlier last week, is this idea that, so often companies talk about consumer behavior or customer behavior. We need to create behavioral change amongst individuals. And I think so often when you talk about creating corporation-based change, right? It's corporations are much bigger emitters than individuals are, and they create products that contribute to that as well, right? Now, that being said, corporations are my clients. So, there are corporations who are keen to do that. But I think that governments need to do 2 meaningful things. And obviously financing is helpful, and being a part of that process, and being, something like the CARICOM Development Fund, where there are these quasi-governmental relationships, entities that exist in support of private sector initiatives or nonprofit initiatives. Those are really, really critical. But I think the government needs to incentivize this work, whether that be through tax incentives, benefits. They need to make that access to finance more available. And in incentivizing it, they also need to regulate it, right? There are very, very few places in the Caribbean where climate regulation exists on the books, right? You know, I'm a part of conversations with the private sector organization of Jamaica, the Jamaica Stock Exchange. The Bank of Jamaica is signaling that they're going to put forward regulations for financial institutions, or a framework through which financial institutions need to report against. And you know, what Alison said about like this politicization of ESG, for example, is really not very helpful at a moment like this, because we need some type of an evaluation framework to say, okay, what is the baseline? Okay, if we have all of this data, what is the baseline? And if we can figure out what that baseline is, what are the meaningful data-driven targets that we can set to improving on that baseline? And we are not mandating the collection of that data in any type of universal way, right? So there's no, and that's unfortunately not unique to the Caribbean, right? This lack of universality is a huge issue in the space, right? Especially, I'm sure Alison can speak to this as well, that, you know, when I work with clients, we're picking which framework we're going to use for ESG, which is a hindrance to progress in so many ways, because now when I look at company A and I look at company B, I can't actually see who is performing more effectively from a sustainability perspective, because the metrics are not equal in weighting, in what they're measuring, and so on. And not even into industry. I'm talking, you know, that doesn't even exist within one industry unless you use the same framework, right? So to now compare companies across industries is even more of a challenge. I think IFRS S1 and S2 is trying in that way, and I'm really happy about that. And I think government should start to look at a regulatory framework that would reflect the universality movement for frameworks as well. I think that would be really helpful. But for me, those two things are really, really important: incentivize and regulate. And without that, you know, I just don't think, until we can't rely on corporations making these decisions out of the goodness of their hearts. And we certainly can't rely on governments who are elected every 4 to 5 years to do that either, right? Because a lot of these initiatives are costly. They're painful. You know, they're not. These are not. A lot of them are not sexy, right? They don't. You know, make for good ads or make for good campaigns. So sorry, I think I spoke a lot about that and maybe veered a little off into.
Could I just respond to the point you made about a kind of universal framework? Because you're absolutely right, and I know we're all hoping, and oh gosh, Mervyn King put a lot of effort into trying to bring all of the different frameworks together, and he's got a lot further, I think, than some of the financial frameworks, but we're still not there. But one of the criticisms that's starting to happen around the world is that people are saying that organisations, whatever sector they're from, because not just private or public, there's also not-for-profit companies who are also trying to report on what they're doing, is that a lot of the reporting is focused on the processes that people or organisations are doing. They're not focusing so much on the outcome. And yeah. I think for the point I made earlier, that, you know, if you're going to say, right, we're going to go in, we're going to clean up a river basin, and this is what we're going to do, you can talk about, well, did we do that? But can you then attribute what you did to the fact the river basin was cleaned? Because there might be other things that happened. Or if it doesn't get cleaned, because again, something else has happened, but you have gone through a process that you anticipated would clean it. So that's where some of these reporting things can get challenging, and then accusations of greenwashing and all of these things does start happening. It's not to say we shouldn't be doing it, but just to be wary that that is a criticism that is starting to come forth, if you like, from those people that are holding organisations' feet to the fire on this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that even underscores kind of what I was saying about, you know, if there is increased criticism in the space, right, and increased anxiety for corporations to ensure that they're not doing things like greenwashing, and in some instances they may not even be intentionally trying to do that, right? They may be over-reporting on something that's just not as relevant, and the consumers are much more educated now on what we need to look for and so on. But again, it speaks to, okay, well, if it's not a requirement by government, why am I going to bother do it anymore if I'm being held to a standard I don't feel I can meaningfully meet? So, you know, again, if you don't regulate that, if you don't require it or mandate it, it really, it reduces the barriers to not doing it, right? So.
Yeah.
Yep.
Omar, sorry, I have a question to Omar, because I'm really interested in his talking about nature-based solutions, because I think, you know, there is a great contribution there. I think, again, and sorry I keep coming up with challenges, because I seem to be spending my life talking to people about the challenges, but you know, obviously one of the challenges around nature-based solutions is the massive population growth in certain parts of the world that's obviously leading to migration. And I'm just wondering how that, you know, how in your experience that's been dealt with and being factored into some of the things that you're looking at.
Well, some of this might be, I think, theoretical. But again, it's coming back to this idea of most of the times, as opposed to carbon, you know, not an ounce, a ton of carbon here is effectively the same as a ton of carbon in Vietnam. But you know, nature-based solutions are much more, because of its very, well, nature, no pun intended, is very localized, because it's all dependent on the ecosystems within which you're developing the solution. And that's why in most cases, if managed properly, you have these associated social benefits. So, you know, a lot of this climate-induced migration is occurring particularly in areas where those same ecosystem services have been degraded and therefore are not producing the benefits that freshwater, heat regulation, and so on. So, you know, I don't think the nature-based solution investment has occurred to a level where you've been able to see it actually reverse or create a more supportive physical environment for these people to not have to migrate, for example. And I think the thing is, in terms of the possible conflict between your population size, growth, and land use, again, if developed in a way that is not planting pine trees in a tropical forest, for example, but in a way that actually,
or even worse, eucalyptus trees.
yes, exactly, just burn
Happened a
down
lot
the
in
entire thing.
Uganda, and they took all the water. Yes.
So, but doing it in a way that, again, is very cognizant of the local ecosystem and, again, other associated issues. You can't have that kind of coexistence. There's no reason to say that nature-based solutions are going to what's the word, kick out agricultural production, for example. There's no reason to say that it could impact on the livability of a space in terms of actual physical location, because nature-based solutions could be as simple as within urban spaces creating biological corridors, for example, by having rooftop habitats or whatever, pollinators. Something as simple as that. You know, that impacts on agricultural productivity, but it doesn't actually reduce the livable space for people. So I think it's really just being, and I have, you know, as I think you said, Alison, it is much more complex than just reducing emissions. It's extremely difficult to collect, even with the improved science. It's extremely difficult to collect that type of data. And I think that's something, even with people in my own sector, you either have be all or nothing. And that could be a very non-productive space to operate in. So I think it's important for us to recognize those drawbacks. But one plug that I could probably make, Kamla, before we go back to Cavelle, is that we are actually trying right now to see how, particularly in terms of nature, how we can support Caribbean businesses to be more thoughtful and intentional in integrating nature and natural capital. We've launched the Caribbean Natural Capital Hub in partnership with ANSA Merchant Bank. And it's a Caribbean space where we're trying to downscale some of these approaches, like the natural capital protocols and so on, task force on nature-related financial disclosures, to really make sense for the Caribbean. Because again, a lot of these things are developed in the sort of global north, where, while it might be difficult for them to collect data, it's like 100 times more difficult for us here. So we're starting on a back foot. So we're in the process of doing, trainings with Caribbean companies. We also have a survey out now to collect information on how companies perceive nature-based reporting. So we can then feed that upwards to these big global institutions to say, okay, do we need to have like an option B? Like, could we do ISSB, TNFD, and so on in a different way that more fits with our particular cultural and sort of data ecosystems? So I'll drop a link for that in the chat. I really encourage any Caribbean company or persons like Ali working in this space to join as well.
Okay, excellent discourse thus far, panelists. And I just want to turn my attention to the chat and share some comments that are coming from our attendees. So we do have Gail Figaro, and in terms of her comment, Gail is saying that there are many resiliency aspects as it pertains to climate change. One fundamental collective flaw we have within the Caribbean is our lack of true long-term orientation. We do not look past the horizon and make decisions that facilitate the protection of our climate past a predetermined point. We have lost the concept of the 7th-generation principle of making decisions which create a sustainable world for many generations to come. And that brings me now to long-term strategies to address climate change, and whether or not the world, or whether or not we in the Caribbean are doing enough on long-term climate strategies. And it takes me back to the comment that Gail has made. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of long-term climate strategies? Any panelists could kick it off.
And if I can ask Alison whether she see a connection with that and the IFRS standards in terms of trying to get companies begin to walk that road. So we will see, because it really is a challenging thing, as Gail said, getting this long-term focus that you're looking at future generations for the impact. Well, and I find the way the IFRS standards were developed, it is a little more friendly to organizations to help them be able to identify first their initial and then through their supplier line and all of that.
Yeah, I think, Hamler, in answer to your question, I think we're still at reasonably early stages with IFRS, with seeing what companies are going to do with IFRS. I mean, a lot of companies are responding to things like the SDG Sustainable Development Goals, and are now saying, okay, what are we, which ones can we pick, and how are we going to respond to those? Because I think we have to be realistic that everybody can't do everything, and so trying to identify either which sectors need to focus on which aspects of this, or which organisations are picking up. I mean, it's the point Ali made. We don't have a uniform way of working out who's doing what. It's very, very difficult. So, I mean, I'm hopeful that we'll get there, but it will take, I think, a couple of years for us to see that coming through. And I mean, you know, I'll just give you an example. You can have two companies in the same sector, oil and gas, and one of them has as their kind of measurement gender, and another one has emissions, and another one might have something else. So how are you comparing, you know, what are they doing within kind of ESG areas? So hopefully we're going to see more conformity, and that will help in the discussion. But I think we're still in early days. I mean, Ali, I don't know what you think, but
yeah, sorry. Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's still a very nascent conversation, and I think, you know, there's still going to be a few more rounds of stakeholder engagement to determine, you know, kind of what that looks like.
Okay, and we do have conversation back and forth in the chat. And Derek Lapat, he has made several comments in the chat, and I would like to invite him to share his thoughts with the panelists and pose his question directly to the panelists. Derek, do you mind?
Certainly, no. I appreciate the opportunity. Sorry, I'm not camera ready. Today's a public holiday, so not dressed for the occasion at all. But good to see folks that I am familiar with, and I will just use a couple of minutes, just say the same thing I think I say frequently. You know, we need to deal with the root causes. Patchwork does not work. It does not work. It just leaves the problem to fester. Getting the right people around the table is important. Having sat with a multi-sectoral group, private, public, and NGO sector, to deal with something as simple as addressing the reduction of the importation and production of expanded polystyrene food containers into a particular Caribbean country, and recognizing that the decision makers around the table, easily 2/3 of them did not even know what the word biodegradable meant. So things like that are fundamental to getting to the root cause, and not thinking that we could patch the problems. Climate change is a symptom. It is not the problem. So we're trying to mitigate, we're trying to adapt. And yes, it is necessary, don't get me wrong. But if we don't try to turn off the tap, that's going to be very challenging. And it starts with education, ensuring that people understand the fundamental issues, and somehow to get us to work together across sectors, industries, and I think more importantly, regionally. I keep harping about, particularly in the Caribbean, each of us try to do our own thing. We keep going at it. When if we were to get these similar thinking people around the table, we could do significantly much more as a region, as a group. Where you get that multiply effect, and you get the bringing together of resources in a way that that brings that added value to the issues. So, I mean, I'm speaking generally, but I've seen this apply to real projects in the region, and it works. Painfully slow, but it works. And I think if we get the momentum going, you could start to get the that snowball effect, and hopefully it will catch on. Thank you.
I now invite anyone by a show of hand, raising your hand and unmuting your mic, to please ask questions directly to the panelists, because I'm not seeing any further comments in the chat.
Okay, so Omar has his hand up.
All right.
Yeah, I just wanted to just respond, support Derek's comment. And Derek has been a real big proponent for getting to the root cause of things, and not thinking about symptoms, but not trying to focus too much on it. I don't want to be the stereotypical NGO person talking about capitalism, but here we are.
I think
so I think if a lot of the focus on symptoms, I think, has been very purposeful, because the root causes are very uncomfortable for people to accept or be accountable for. And it's really the fact that, the historians could correct me if I'm wrong, but, if you look at what they call the hockey stick curves, which are those rapidly increasing curves from everything from carbon dioxide emissions to biodiversity loss, etc., overconsumption of agriculture, all of those things effectively start around the same time that the sort of modern capitalist experiment started. So, there are very clear parallels, and no one's saying that particular approach didn't necessarily, for a time, increase human well-being, but every single report now is clearly saying that all of those indicators of human well-being, quality of life, equality, etc., has been declining. Global inequality is the highest it's ever been. Clearly we're seeing other things around peace and conflict and so on. And all of those things, I think, are tied to this very specific model of overconsumption. The richest 10% account for more than 50% of global CO2 emissions, and the richest 10% capture over 3/4 of the world's material requirements, private consumption. And it's those things, that the production of those things, that drive emissions. So, I think there is something to be said about rethinking, even at a smaller level, a regional level, what do we classify as what development looks like? Is it something that needs to be as materially consumptive as it traditionally has been? And I mean, I know it's an extremely nuanced conversation to have, but I think it's something that, is important to have. So, what is our definition of development? And therefore, what kind of pathway do we want to take to get to there? And how do the things that contribute most to emissions and so on fit into that particular pathway? Again, it's something that in many cases might be philosophical and take some time, but if you don't do that, you'll be doing like what Derek says and trying to just put band-aids over a bunch of different cracks. But if the underlying thing is chugging along, it'll just be a ton of band-aids that you have to be spending money on.
If I can respond, because I totally agree with what Omar and Derek are saying. I mean, I find this whole concept of net zero crazy, because you've got countries who are they're continuing to create emissions, but they're becoming net zero by doing other things. But actually, if you look at it globally, we're not becoming net zero globally as a result of what is going on. And so, I think too many countries are getting hung up and focused on we need to get to net zero, rather than necessarily saying, okay, how do we actually reduce our emissions, not compensate for them? And I think, but again, I agree that's a difficult conversation to have, because you're then dealing with how are you supporting your populations within your countries? You know, have they got, you know, energy security, food security, all of these other issues, which make it very complex. So you can understand in one way why government, it's not an easy thing for governments to come up with decisions about. But there does need to be a fundamental shift, and how we get there, greater minds than me, I'm sure, need to think about it, because, you know, it's a very difficult thing to deal with.
Agreed. And that brings me to another area we haven't yet touched now, the vulnerable groups. And the fact is that traditionally, underrepresented communities, including women, youth, those living in marginalized groups, or the urban poor, as we would call it, those in rural areas that are in areas that are more susceptible to climate change, especially for us in the Caribbean region, where, again, sea levels are rising, and we're smaller island states, right? So given the impact and the capacity of our region to address the issues, we're hearing of the issues around finances and all of that. We've heard that we contribute less to the issue, but the impact is severe for us as well. How do our governments across the region collaboratively, because Omar also said, and even Derek, there's a call for us to work regionally on these issues. How could governments across the region really truly address this, especially since we know that some groups are impacted more than others, women, the youth, and those in marginalized communities as well? What are the panelists' thoughts around that issue?
I see Alison is unmuted, so I don't know if she wanted to go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I just didn't mute myself. Apologies. Please go ahead.
No, I mean, I think, you know, Cavelle, you raised it perfectly. Environmental issues are as intersectional as, you know, every other issue that we face, right? And so the groups, you know, amongst us within our populations who are already the most marginalized will be the most affected by this. And, you know, there's a tremendous amount of data, you know, I'm sure Omar can speak a little bit more to it than I can, but there's a tremendous amount of data to demonstrate exactly what you're saying, you know, that it's only going to exacerbate the underlying challenges that we're facing as societies. And I think, you know, when we think about things, you know, as radical or as challenging as it feels to think about right now, about, you know, things like necessary migration from parts of our islands or parts of our region, how are we going to manage doing that in an equitable way? How are we going to manage ensuring the safety of everyone? Are we considering those things, right? When we're talking about where we're going to build, you know, community infrastructure, how we're going to do it, are we thinking about what areas we're going to do that in a way that considers what the environmental risks are as well? I think, you know, all of those things are hugely important, and I think so many of our young nations haven't had the benefit of, you know, urban planning and designing our cities and our countries in ways that meaningfully support our population. And I think that this poses, you know, yet another threat to that, and a very, very significant one.
How are you dealing with food in the Caribbean? Because I know, you know, one of the projects I was involved with just before we left Uganda was around the fact that we were having to try and slowly introduce different foods into the diet, and replace you know, food groups that Ugandans have been eating for hundreds of years, because they wouldn't be able to grow them within the next generation. And obviously the pushback you get from that people don't like it, or how you actually then educate them that they've got to start growing them, how you actually get people to grow different foods. And I wondered if you had some of the similar things going on, and how you were dealing with just fundamental things about that people need, and issues around water and clean water, and having, you know, clean water to drink, because obviously they're the basis of us existing. So even those things are coming under threat.
For sure.
Yeah, I think maybe I could just touch on that, but also I think one of our attendees, David Small, had a question. So I don't know if he still wanted to.
Yeah, I was going to direct it
Oh.
after to him, because I only missed the hand. I missed the hand after. So
No, it's fine.
if you're giving way, if the panel is giving way, sure, certainly, Mr. Small.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Appreciate this has been a really enlightening and rich session. It's that's close to my heart. I am firmly in Omar's camp. We have an issue that we're trying to treat with here on a micro level, but when the real problem is at a macro level, in my respectful view. Omar is very much in the data. When you look at the data on GHG emissions, there's 2 countries that account for 2/3 of the global emissions in the world. I'm not calling names. We want to see what we in the region can do to how we can influence that. I am deathly afraid that we're going to be sitting here, and when the seawater is coming over the shorelines in our parts of the world, the others who have inland regions to go to, they'll just move inland. We don't have inland to go to. We have to figure out a way also, respectfully, that the way we measure economic growth is what has gotten us here. We've been measuring, saying that if a country has positive economic growth, that's wonderful. If it has negative economic growth, that's bad. The issue with that is that when you track the data, when you plot GDP against emissions, whenever GDP goes up, you tend to have an increase in energy consumption, and then you have a correlated increase in emissions. So for so long as the international global community is married to positive economic growth without some regenerative element in there, I'm picking up on Kamala's nice team word, regenerative, we have to have an element in the way in which you measure how countries are successful. Because if we continue with this current model, we're all in the Caribbean region going to be underwater, and the countries with large land masses will be like, well, the Caribbean is gone. Yeah, and that is my fear. And because the other point I want to make is about the time frame. I think that, you know, we're stuck in this part of the world, as opposed to other places too, with short-termism in terms of how we plan for things. I listen to the political leaders. I listen to the international organizations. Last week, they had a guy from IDB said, listen, the Caribbean region is going to need $12 billion in investment to try to get us back, to prepare us for what is coming. It's not that it's not coming, you know, it's coming. And this is where the theme of this session, climate emergency. I'm not sure how much of us understand what an emergency is, what the climate emergency is. 11 years ago, when the University of Hawaii announced, they had a group of scientists say, listen, they announced what they call the climate departure dates for the rest of cities around the world. Lots of people were like, yeah, interesting. Because we are working on our time, our body's time. But the planet, once something is lost in the planet, you can never regain it. Once you know you get to a certain heat level, you can't cool it back. And this is the issue. So I think this is a really important session. But I think that we need to have some sort of way to come together, because we can all do our little pieces. And in my view, our little pieces will give us some measure of comfort that we've done what we can, but it will not stop what is coming. The only way to stop what is coming is to get a groundswell, get all the Caribbean leaders to put all the other issues aside and say, listen, I'm not getting into that, but we need to put all the other issues aside and go to the major body and say, listen, we are going to die. I read just 2 days ago that.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, I'm stopping. I have too much data. I'm gone. Forgive me.
We will hear from David in part.
I'm good.
Panel, but yeah, we just have 3 more minutes for this panel. So I want to ask, thanks, David. Ask Cavelle to have her panelists share their closing thoughts and then hand over back to me. Thanks, Cavelle.
Yes. So I was going to say that as we bring this panel conversation to an end, I do want to ask each panelist. So we start with Ali in the same way we began. Ali, Omar, Alison, if you could share your last words on this topic, please, that you want to leave us with.
Sure. Thank you so much, everyone. This has been such an enriching conversation for me. And I think, David, you did a great job of ensuring that we didn't have to say too many last words, because that, was so well said. I do think we need, a groundswell of support in addressing this emergency, as you so rightly put it. And, I think all of us here are very encouraged and incentivized to do something about it collectively. And hopefully we can take this conversation offline and, kind of into the real world and collaborate on initiatives that really meaningfully move the needle.
Thank you. Omar?
Yeah, just thanks so much everyone for having me on the panel. I think Derek also just said what I what I think we need to do, which is to have really that, to try and punch above our weight, which we have been doing in many different ways. We mentioned Prime Minister Motley and her trying to overhaul this financial architecture that's been keeping many sort of global South countries down and indebted. So I think, again, understanding not just our power as consumers to push companies to make right decisions, but to very importantly understand if we get these things on the political agenda, then they show up in the political agenda and they become things that governments have to start making decisions around. To not just focus on the symptoms like the floods and the hurricanes, but understand that it's about adaptation, resilience, and how can we get leaders to start talking about that.
Yep, fully agreed. Alison?
Yeah, it's been a fascinating conversation. I have to admit, I'm not full of a lot of hope at the moment. When you look at, we're just preparing for an election in the UK, and just before I came on, I was listening to it, and very much these climate issues are what are being squeezed out when people are talking about issues around what's money going to be spent on, and God alone knows what's going to happen in the US with the election that's looming. I hope there can be some sanity, because as you guys have been talking about, it's not just the Caribbean that's disappearing. I live in a place called Yorkshire in the UK, and great chunks of Yorkshire are disappearing into the North Sea as a result of climate change. Somebody I know is in Bangladesh. Bangladesh has almost disappeared. So there are real serious challenges that do need to be addressed. So I do hope people get it. I think the younger generations are. I think if they can get into power, that might be more helpful. But I think, the grey-haired old men, how much they're really focusing on this, I do have a concern, to be honest. And sorry to end on such a kind of negative note, but that's really responding to what David and Derek have been saying. But fingers crossed, we can all keep trying.
Thank you so much to our esteemed panelists. And as we bring this conversation to a close, I just want to incorporate some of the planning principles into all of this as well. As we seek to look at sustainable and environmentally friendly ways of doing things going forward, and we heard about economic development, and we consider all the impact of how we measure economic development as well and economic growth, we must also consider the role of planners, and it's a critical component of planning for climate change as well. At the heart of all the new planning principles is the concept of broad-based sustainability with environmental, social, economic, and cultural dimensions being incorporated into that. I do believe that effective planning for climate change requires careful attention be paid to a balance of the different dimensions of environmental sustainability, a balance between the environment, social, and economic response to climate change requires a bit of a paradigm shift as we consider I should say, a more balanced world in addressing some of the issues that were highlighted here today. So thank you very much. I want to thank the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute for inviting me to moderate this panel this afternoon. And it was my pleasure being your moderator. And I hand it over to you, Kamala, to bring a close to this specific panel discussion. Thank you so much.